So mindfulness seems to be everywhere today. We find it in schools, in universities, in hospitals, and military academies. We find it in boardrooms and parliament buildings. For some it's a therapy, for others a technology, and for some it's a lifestyle choice. Tens of millions of people admit to practicing it in North America alone. Mindfulness seems to be whatever we need it to be. It emerges into the public discourse like a mystical panacea from the ancient East, the cure for all the ills of contemporary societies. But what actually is it? Fundamental research into mindfulness in various disciplines in the sciences and the social sciences and the humanities has grown exponentially in the last decade or so. Researchers are attempting to provide an evidence base for what mindfulness does to people, as well as a conceptual base for what mindfulness might actually be. When we say that someone is a mindful person, what are we saying about that person? When people call for a mindful society, do they really know what such a society would be like? And would you want to live in it? Based partially in experiential learning, this course aims to give you the theoretical and practical skills to understand and to critically assess mindfulness in its various forms for yourself. Encompassing its ancient traditions and cutting-edge science, this course seeks to demystify mindfulness as a technology for life in the 21st century. Whether you're entirely new to mindfulness, looking for clarity, or an experienced practitioner looking for some more depth, whether you're a mindfulness teacher looking to broaden your understanding, or a therapist looking to diversify your knowledge, no matter who you are, I hope this unusual course has something to offer you. The particular way that this course combines academic investigation in Lesson 1 of each module with practical exercises in our meditation labs in Lesson 2 makes this course unique. By the time you complete this course, you'll have a sound understanding of the meaning and significance of mindfulness from various academic disciplinary standpoints, ranging from psychology through philosophy to politics. And, just as importantly, you'll have experienced the equivalent of a complete 8-week mindfulness training course based on the famous MBSR, or mindfulness-based stress reduction program. This special combination of theoretical and practical learning reflects the nature of mindfulness as a field. One of its great challenges to us today is the way that it emphasizes the critical importance of our own personal experience of it as a resource for our understanding of it. So you need to be prepared to do some honest introspection during this course as part of the process of study. What you experience and feel really matters, and what you get out of this course will at least partially be determined by the sincerity you bring into it. Having said that, it is possible that you might want to follow only the Lesson 1 content if your interest is entirely academic, or only the Lesson 2 content if your interest is entirely practical, and that's fine, but the course has been carefully designed to combine the two for a more full and rich learning experience, so I think you'll get most out of it if you do both in parallel. This course has been based on the popular course, The Mindfulness Revolution, that I've been teaching in the Interdisciplinary Honours Academy here in Leiden for a number of years. And it also arises from the Mental Praxis research project into mindfulness and philosophy. So I'm really grateful to the students at Leiden who've taught me so much about how to engage with and learn from this fascinating material. And I can't wait to see how you guys get on with it too. We've had a lot of help putting together this course, especially the fantastic crew at the Centre for Innovation in The Hague, but I also want to acknowledge the help and support of some wonderful practitioners and scholars who've given their time, experience and labour to this project. In particular, Professor Rebecca Crane and colleagues over at Bangor University Centre for Mindfulness Research and Practice, and then Professor Willem Keuken and colleagues over at the University of Oxford's Mindfulness Centre. I'm delighted, in fact, that Willem has even directly contributed material to each module, so you'll meet him in due course. And then we have the remarkable Stephen Batchelor, who has also been generous enough to share his wisdom and experience with us, so you'll meet him soon too. I think this is probably more than enough for an introduction, and you can check out the structure and details on the course site. If you have questions, ask them. If you have problems, shout or whisper. If you need to go to the toilet, you don't need to raise your hand, just go to the toilet. But perhaps most importantly, remember to be gentle with yourself as you make your way through this adventure. It's possible that you'll encounter some things about yourself that you find challenging, so please allow yourself some time to deal with whatever comes up. If you want to tell a family member or a friend that you're taking this course, or even better, if you want to take this course together with them, that's a great idea. You should also make use of the forums and the community features of this course to connect with your fellow students. You might be surprised to see that we all encounter really similar issues and problems, and that it can be very reassuring to know this. Be gentle with each other too, okay? Mindfulness might strike you as a solitary pursuit, but like most journeys, this is one that's better traveled in company. It's my pleasure and my privilege to travel some of it with you.
Having all the freedom to study online is nice, but this might make it difficult to focus and start studying. When learning online, you need to become a self-directed learner to make the most of it. Here are some tips to get you started. First, read through the syllabus. Before you start, make sure you understand the course by reading the syllabus, grading policy, and the resources. The second tip, plan your study time. Fit the course into your activities. Plan weekly study times in your calendar and tell your friends and family not to disturb you. Make sure to visit the course at least 3 times a week instead of binge watching all the videos in one go. This will help you retain information better and feel engaged. Tip 3. Actively participate in the course. Connect with fellow learners by joining in the conversation and asking and answering questions in the discussion forum. Tip 4. You can find many ways to collaborate, like joining a study group, upvoting answers you really liked, or sharing material you created for the course. A successful learner contributes to a learning community. Here's how to do that. An academic, informed debate is respectful of each other's arguments using civil discourse. Avoid negativity, such as stereotyping, discrimination, or inflammatory remarks. Give some thought to your arguments and avoid logical fallacies. Cite evidence such as sources and data to support your arguments. Make sure you follow personal online safety rules and do not share out personal details such as your email address or phone number. Now you are ready to be a successful learner. Enjoy your journey with our online course.
So hello and welcome. Since you've made it this far, that's into the first session of the first module of this course, you've already made a series of momentous decisions and choices. Most importantly, for whatever reason, you've decided that you want to know a little bit more about what this thing called mindfulness actually is. And you've even decided, whether you're fully aware of this or not, that you'd like to experiment on yourself a little in order to explore what this thing called mindfulness feels like for you. In fact, one of the things that's really exciting for me is that you're here because you want to be here. Now, you could be doing all kinds of other things with your time, but you're doing this. So I'm guessing that you're not being forced to do this, although maybe you are, and probably you haven't been prescribed this by your doctor, although maybe you have. So there's something about this thing called mindfulness that has caught your interest and made you think that this might be a good way to spend some of your very precious time. As it happens, taking some time to think about why we're here is actually a pretty good place to start. The reasons why people become interested in mindfulness can be fascinating in themselves, not only but also because it's not immediately obvious to most people, or perhaps even to anyone, what this thing called mindfulness actually means. What is this thing called mindfulness, and why are you interested in it? As you might expect, I've asked this question of quite a few people in the past, some of them students at university, some of them colleagues at conferences, and some of them participants in stress reduction or cognitive therapy courses that I've taught in various contexts. The answers have been myriad. Indeed, the answers to this question are so interesting that entire research projects have been run in order to survey and catalogue the various reasons. You'll get the chance to explain your reasons to your classmates and to me during this module, but I'd like to spend a little time today talking about some of the reasons that seem to emerge most often. Perhaps you'll recognize some of them. It's interesting to see what we can learn about the representation of mindfulness today from these reasons. Recent studies have asked participants on mindfulness courses to explain their motivations for attendance. In most cases, participants are given a list of options that the researchers have pre-selected as reasons that they think should explain the motivations of participants in formal mindfulness interventions. In general, the results suggest that the vast majority of people who take up mindfulness do so because they feel that it will help them to reduce negative experiences. In fact, about 95% of people recognize this as their motivation for participation. This category also includes the aspiration to be calmer, to regulate their emotion more effectively, and so on. About 30% of people hope that mindfulness will help them to enhance their sense of well-being, which also includes aspects such as feeling happier, being more fulfilled, being more self-aware, and perhaps even having better concentration and focus. And indeed, a similar proportion of people really become involved because somebody else has told them that they might like it or they might enjoy it, it might interest them in some way. And a minority of people, about 6%, take up mindfulness because they associate it with religious or spiritual cultivation, and in particular with Buddhism. These general responses by people who are taking formally approved and accredited mindfulness courses, like mindfulness-based stress reduction, it's MBSR, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or MBCT, do capture quite a few of the most important ways that mindfulness is represented today. In fact, perhaps you already have a sense of mindfulness as a technique or technology that might help you to cope with or deal with various negative aspects of your life. And in fact, it might also help you to enhance various positive aspects of your life. And given how pervasive and popular mindfulness has become in recent years, it's quite likely that you already know people who have told you about their experiences of mindfulness in these terms. But one result from these formal studies that surprises me is the relatively small proportion of people who apparently come to mindfulness for reasons associated with spirituality or religion. Given the amount of mindfulness taught in Buddhist contexts, including so-called secular Buddhist contexts, including vipassana or insight meditation centers, this is especially surprising. There are lots of possible reasons for this, which include, for instance, the fact that data like this is usually drawn from populations who are attending formal 8-week secular mindfulness programs of the kinds that we'll discuss in Module 2 of this course. So the population is, at least to some extent, pre-selected based on their instrumental motivations. That is, people learning Buddhist mindfulness are effectively excluded from the data. Another possible reason is the vagueness of the terms spiritual and religious, which can mean all kinds of things, positively and negatively, to different people. And it's not always clear how or whether these differ from concepts like self-cultivation, for instance, which might in turn seem very similar to something like the cultivation of well-being and so on. Something that is clear from my own experience is that this last question of spirituality is quite often unresolved in the minds of mindfulness practitioners and everyone else. And when I say that it's unresolved, I mean something like this. Some people come to mindfulness precisely because they've been convinced that it has nothing to do with spirituality, but at the same time fearing that it might have something to do with spirituality. For these people, the idea of spirituality signifies something like the absence of scientific reason. So while their motivation is not about spirituality per se, spirituality is one of their unresolved concerns about mindfulness. Their fear is that contemporary mindfulness is somehow in denial about its relationship with spirituality, that it both isn't and is a spiritual discipline at the same time. In fact, this kind of lack of resolution is also present in quite a lot of the scholarship about mindfulness, which often navigates uncertainly and nervously around questions of Buddhism and Buddhist psychology, as though talking too much about what is sometimes called the B word might undermine the scientific credibility of the work being done. Underlying this view is a deep-seated cultural skepticism in Western societies that forms of knowledge that have originated anywhere other than Europe are unscientific and ultimately muddle-headed. And it's at least partially because of this that practitioners and scholars remain slightly anxious about what kind of knowledge we're interested in when we're interested in mindfulness. But this is also one of the reasons why mindfulness is so cutting edge and so exciting. It relies on and builds bridges between different traditions of thinking about and experimenting on human consciousness. Today, mindfulness emerges as the real child of a global modernity, bringing together knowledge, theory, and method from multiple disciplines and many regions from around the world. In other words, when we talk about spirituality in the context of modern mindfulness, we need not be talking about New Ageism or the hippie movement, although we might be, and we might also be talking about a scientist's fear of association with these. We need not be talking about something that opposes scientific method or reason at all. Instead, we could be talking about the idea that mindfulness is a kind of consciousness discipline that exists at the intersection of myriad forms of knowledge and inquiry, rooted in the creativity and openness of contemporary science. In other words, our anxiety about the tension between scientific rationality and spirituality is one of the ways in which mindfulness remains rather mysterious and provocative today. So even if you're not someone who worries about this personally, the chances are good that you live in a society in which this is a general concern of modernity. It might be worth actually pausing at this point to ask yourself about your motivation for studying this course. In particular, why not check in with yourself right now before we really get started and see how you feel about the possibilities that, for instance, this journey might be an entirely scientific one, or that it might also involve elements of a spiritual journey, however we might define that, or that it might also be both of these things at once. How do you feel about that? In the rest of this first module, we're going to take a brief look at some sketches of what mindfulness means to different people. We're going to do this in the form of exploring three big archetypes or ideal types that represent popular preconceptions about mindfulness, including some fears and some prejudices, but also some romances about it. And then in the rest of this course, we're going to slowly and systematically work out which elements of these preconceptions stand up to scrutiny and which are simply misconceptions or fantasies. We're going to look at the figures of the monk, the ninja, and the zombie. And today we've already considered some of the preconceptions of the scientist, our fourth model. These sketches, which are sometimes ridiculous, also provide us with a way into the big question: what the heck is this thing called mindfulness? At the very least, these preconceptions reveal that there are a number of different and sometimes competing understandings of and associations with mindfulness today, which can leave us confused or even mystified about what it actually is, or even whether it's actually anything at all. So having explored some of this terrain, the rest of the course aims to map out and demystify the landscape, explaining what this mindfulness thing really looks like today, and how we can sensibly talk about it in different ways and in different senses. So in our last session, we explored some of the reasons why people like you and me might become interested in mindfulness. In particular, we considered the popular contemporary image of mindfulness as a scientific technique or technology that is deployed in secular contexts and often for therapeutic purposes. And we associated this approach with the image of a scientist. In today's session, as part of this little series of talks exploring different preconceptions about mindfulness and what it might mean to be a mindful person, we're going to take some time to investigate one of the most popular and pervasive associations with mindfulness, and that is the image of the Buddhist monk. As we discussed in the last session, the purpose of these little sketches is really to reveal some popular impressions about mindfulness before we start looking more seriously at where these impressions might have come from and what kind of value they might have. One of the things that's fascinating about these images is that while they often contain a number of misperceptions and mistakes, even fabrications, they're usually based on, or at least come close to, some genuine insights and associations. Hence, exploring these images is quite a good way to orient ourselves at the start of a course like this one. We can learn quite a lot about what kind of assumptions we're bringing with us, and thus what kind of work we need to do while we're here. Now, to some extent, the image of the Buddhist monk represents a classical aspirational image of spiritual development. It sits somewhere between the sage and the saint as what Robert Neville has called a spiritual model. It expresses our ideal of enlightenment and our emancipation from the confines of everyday knowledge and wisdom. In other words, while expertise and understanding in everyday life might make us good at our jobs or successful at exams or able to solve concrete practical problems, the wisdom of the sage seems more attuned to dealing with the grandest questions of meaning in life, the universe, and everything. So it's not technical knowledge, but rather it emerges from patience and experience and attunement with the world. Indeed, the figure of the sage often appears to lack basic factual knowledge and expertise about everyday tasks. Sages can be idiots. The wisdom of the sage is usually represented as somehow seeing through the everyday to the profound, as though the everyday world with which we're so obsessed and in which we constantly strive for more accomplishments, more possessions, more money, and so on, is itself somehow debased or sullied or even illusionary. Hence, the sage seems to embody an alternative moral order in which worldly or material success is not only seen as trivial, but is also seen as essentially vacuous. It's not only that we spend our time and energy on things that have little value, but it's also that we should, with moral force, we should spend our time and energy on more elevated pursuits instead. So what does this mean in practice? Well, in practice it means something a bit like this. The model of the sage teaches us that instead of spending our time worrying about passing an exam, impressing someone at a job interview, or earning enough money for a new iPhone, we should instead spend our time sitting in meditation on the nature of ourself and the present moment, sitting under a tree. Instead of fretting about mistakes we made in the past, feeling unhappy about our weight or embarrassed about our clothing, or being angry about the injustice that an undeserving colleague got the promotion that we wanted at work, we should instead spend our time appreciating beautiful patterns being made in the clouds in the sky, or the delicate feeling of rain on our skin, or the wonderful feeling of warmth that the sun leaves on our face. Now, this kind of sagacity involves a self-conscious and pretty deliberate reorientation of our relationship with life itself. Because it involves moving against the prevailing norms and values of commercial societies, it requires of us tremendous amounts of self-discipline, practice, and cultivation. The sage is committed and dedicated, devoted, which also gives him or her an aura of purity and sacredness. We revere the sage precisely because she is better than us. We could be like her had we the necessary discipline and awareness, but we don't, or we choose not to, so we're not. And as this course develops, we see how this classical idea of the sage shares a number of features with the environment of mindfulness today. And for some people, the association between the cultivation of mindfulness and the cultivation of wisdom or enlightenment is very strong. Indeed, as we'll see in Module 3, these associations are basic to the concept of mindfulness in many traditions of philosophy around the world. One of the most immediate connections that many people make between mindfulness and the spiritual hero of the sage is mediated by this figure of the Buddhist monk. As we've already seen in the last session, and as we'll see over and over again throughout this course, it is well known that there is a sense, actually quite a complicated sense, in which mindfulness emerges from Buddhist traditions, and hence for some, its practice is always and already associated with this image of the monk. From these associations, we can recognize the following three popular preconceptions about mindfulness today. The first is that mindfulness is somehow Asian or Oriental, and so it's not clear how it might fit in to Western societies and cultures. And we might identify this preconception as the problem of Orientalism, which can work to both attract and repel people with different ideological dispositions, as we'll see. The second is that the practice of mindfulness is essentially, so at root and deep down, a religious practice, no matter what anyone tells you to the contrary. Its purpose is only therapeutic to the extent that the Buddha was the original therapist, and his teachings emancipate us from suffering by liberating us from ourselves. Now, we might identify this preconception as the problem of secularism, which, like the problem of Orientalism, acts to attract some and repel other people. This problem can make people slightly nervous about the kind of ethical commitment expected of those who decide to take up the practice of mindfulness. However, it's also associated with a surprisingly common assertion these days that Buddhism is not really a religion at all. So the third preconception is that to practice mindfulness properly, you have to sit in a particular way, probably the lotus position. You have to hold your hands in a complicated pattern or mudra, you have to chant a mantra, you have to burn incense and shave off all your hair. And ideally you have to sit on top of a mountain, next to a lake, in a temple, or under a tree. Now we might identify this preconception as the problem of trappings, which is closely related to both the problems of Orientalism and secularism. And again, this preconception can attract or repel potential practitioners depending on their ideological standpoint. As we'll see later, these trappings can be helpful for some people who find them helpful, but they're not basic to the practice of mindfulness, and they can also make practitioners anxious about what it means to be doing it right when they practice. So I hope this little sketch of the monk as a kind of spiritual hero has helped us to recognize some of the popular preconceptions and some of the assumptions about mindfulness today. Our little friend, the monk, will stick around with us to help out during the rest of this course. In the next session, we're going to turn our attention to a different kind of spiritual model, the warrior, and in our case, the ninja. So following on from the models of the scientist and the monk, in this session we're going to consider the example of the warrior as an aspirational icon in modern societies, and especially how the features of this classical ideal might be associated with mindfulness today. In fact, quite a few people, especially younger people, become interested in mindfulness because of this perceived connection between it and the martial arts. The character of the spirit warrior or warrior monk has been common in literature and popular culture throughout history in various parts of the world. But for recent generations, this model is perhaps best exemplified by the Jedi Knight, who sits in quiet meditation, quieting his mind to listen for the living force around him, or perhaps by our friend the mythical ninja. In many cultures, the warrior as spiritual hero represents an ideal of psychic integrity. Rather than being a thoughtless or arbitrary agent of violence, this warrior represents the human aspiration towards disciplined control over our attention, awareness, and emotional state. Indeed, the warrior emerges as the most extreme and accomplished version of this ideal, since his or her psychic integrity is tested and actually cultivated in extremis in the face of danger, violence, and death. In the end, part of the warrior's integrity resides in his or her abandonment of their sense of self. Their actions must be in the service of a greater good, not the result of personal desires, instrumental reason, or ego-driven volition. Their disciplined self-control and self-deprivation become a radical form of selflessness, which ultimately resembles a spiritual accomplishment. Hence, somewhat like our monk in the last session, the ninja seems to embody an alternative moral order in which our attachments to material goods and even to our emotional states themselves are seen as essentially flawed and decadent and degenerate. When we live our lives caught up in the rat race of everydayness, chasing possessions and indulging our emotions, we're simply failing to act with adequate discipline, attention, and awareness. We're behaving in a manner unsuited to our basic integrity. Hence, the warrior represents our aspiration to be better people by being less concerned with objects and desires and more concerned with cultivating a disciplined sense of selflessness. So what does this mean in practice? Well, in practice it means something like this. The model of the warrior teaches us that instead of spending our time indulging our whims and desires for pleasure and luxury, which soften our resolve and undermine our integrity, we should instead spend our time and energy cultivating our discipline by deliberately depriving ourselves of those things that we might want. Instead of lounging on the couch, vegetating in front of the television, or dozing on the beach, we should instead spend our time cultivating our minds and bodies through rigorous programs of meditation and yoga and the martial arts, such that we approach something like mastery of ourselves. Like the monk, then, the ninja here is a model of devotion and commitment in a society that is characterized by indulgence, weakness of will, frivolity, and fickleness. The ideal of the warrior calls upon us to reflect on our mortality and on our lives as a constant process of confronting and overcoming death. The warrior ideal asserts that we would be better people if we were able constantly to hold in our attention the possibility that this moment right now might be our very last. Hence, the discipline of the ninja manifests not only in tremendous physical skill and competence, not only in selflessness of conduct, but also in the ability to maintain a radically present moment awareness. Put together, these features make the ninja calm and tranquil in the face of suffering, adversity, and danger, even in the face of death itself. Now, as this course develops, we will see how this classical ideal of the warrior shares a number of important features with the environment of mindfulness today. And for some people, the association between the cultivation of mindfulness and the cultivation of discipline and integrity in the present moment is very strong. Indeed, as we'll see in modules 3 and 4, these associations are not limited to the application of mindfulness in military contexts, although they're found there too, but rather are very general. In fact, we might recognize at least the following 3 popular preconceptions about mindfulness today, which seem to emerge from this model. First, we're talking about the practice of mindfulness as austere, disciplined, and unforgiving, requiring practitioners to hold perfect, sometimes tortuous postures for long periods until it hurts, and then to carry on after it hurts as well. People who enjoy mindfulness, therefore, are just not doing it right. We might identify this preconception as the problem of discipline, which can work to attract or repel people with different aesthetic tastes and dispositions, and which seriously challenges the permissive and compassionate tone of much mindfulness training that goes on today. The second is that the practice of mindfulness involves the cultivation of esoteric powers, such as levitation or superhuman fighting abilities like energy balls or force powers. Mindfulness makes us spontaneously aware of what's going on in our surroundings, and thus makes us able to respond instantaneously to anything that happens around us. Hence, practicing mindfulness also means practicing physical disciplines, such as yoga, qigong, or the martial arts. Now, we might identify this preconception as the problem of magic, which can work to attract certain people who will end up probably being rather disappointed, and to scare off other people who simply don't want to be associated with esoteric practices, even though these practices probably have no place in modern mindfulness. The contagious power of this preconception can be seen in all kinds of places, but perhaps most famously in the ideas of the US Army's infamous 1st Earth Battalion in the 1970s. And the third preconception is that the practice of mindfulness is centrally concerned with the death of the self, not only in the sense that it cultivates a distinctly present moment focus and hence causes the falling away of emotional investments, but also in the sense that it confronts us with mortality itself by preparing us for encounters with death. We might identify this preconception as the problem of the self, which is closely related to issues that we'll discuss in the next session about the fear of a type of intimacy between mindfulness and mindlessness. And it's also related to the problem of secularism that we explored in the last session. Now, one of the distinctions of the problem of self here, though, is the way in which it moves our discourse away from therapeutic issues altogether and suggests that mindfulness is really a form of existential pursuit. And as we'll see later, this is a pervasive anxiety in the field. So I hope this little sketch of the ninja as a spiritual hero has helped us to recognize some popular preconceptions and assumptions about mindfulness today. Like the monk from our last session, our friend the ninja will stick around with us and help us out during the rest of this course. In our next session, though, we're going to turn our attention to a different kind of spiritual model, this time a model of a nightmare rather than a dream. We're going to look at the case of the zombie. So in the last few sessions, we've spent quite some time exploring some of the ways in which mindfulness is represented in popular culture and in contemporary societies. In particular, we've considered the images of the scientist, the monk, and then the ninja as archetypes that illustrate some of the associations and preconceptions that are prevalent around mindfulness today. In each case, we've seen how the image corresponds to a specific model of aspiration and spiritual development, And rather than being, or perhaps as well as being, slightly ridiculous, we've seen that each of these models provides us with some insight into how mindfulness is perceived and motivated, and also what it might actually be in practice. In today's session, we're going to consider briefly the reverse of these ostensibly positive representations. In other words, when we talk about mindfulness today, what are the negative preconceptions or images of nightmares that occupy people's thoughts? As it happens, some of the introductory literature of mindfulness today makes explicit reference to a number of fears in order to reassure new practitioners that their preconceptions are essentially groundless. One of the most famous of these is probably this passage from Jon Kabat-Zinn, who says, "When we speak of meditation, it is important for you to know that this is not some weird cryptic activity as our popular culture might have it. It does not involve becoming some kind of zombie." In fact, the image of the zombie is really quite helpful for us in our quest to understand what frightens people about mindfulness, and we'll be returning to it quite frequently in the rest of this course, especially when we talk about politics later on. Of course, the zombie is an icon of horror for all kinds of reasons. Most importantly, perhaps, is the image of what happens to a human being when he or she has lost his sense of self, or perhaps lost his self entirely. The zombie is what humans look like after their self or their ego or their personality has died, and coincidentally, also what they look like after they have literally died. The zombie is our nightmare of what the post-human condition might look like. What's more, we think of zombies as forms of mindless automata, slowly going through the movements and motions of life, but without meaningful emotional engagement, and without the application of discriminatory or instrumental reason. And it's because of this that zombies emerge as a type of slave, unable to act for their own benefit, indeed unable even to conceive of what this might entail. They are a vision of the human body that has shed its humanity, leaving only a kind of zero level of unreflective, craving non-life. Hence, when we talk about mindfulness and the fear of zombies, what we're really talking about is something like the following three preconceptions about mindfulness. First is that the practice of mindfulness is really about learning to dissemble and eradicate our ego, our personality, and ultimately our sense of self itself. It involves shedding our emotional attachments and our volitional imperatives, leaving us as the equivalent of empty husks or shells of bare consciousness. Now, we might identify this preconception as the negative variant on the problem of the self that we also saw in the last sessions, where the idea of shedding aspects of ourselves was seen as a form of liberation or self-transformation. But here it resembles a kind of retardation or even death. The second preconception is that the practice of mindfulness is basically about trying not to think about anything in any way recognizable as thinking. It involves abandoning rationality and instrumental reason and critical judgment. It's about sitting in a space of vacuity or void in which we can no longer think properly or proactively, but instead we merely respond instinctively to whatever happens around us. Instead of acting positively in a driven way towards a goal or accomplishment, mindfulness encourages us to stagger around slowly and aimlessly, simply feeling the direct and unprocessed sensations of our body as we move. We might identify this preconception as the problem of irrationality, in which stepping outside goal-oriented and discrepancy-based thinking is not seen as a means of emancipation from the iron cage of reason, as it might have been in our last two sessions, but is instead seen as the collapse of thinking per se. The third preconception is that the practice of mindfulness is really about internalizing a repressive ideological vision of the meaning of being human, which prevents us from resisting authority or challenging the status quo. In other words, mindfulness is about reducing ourselves to a kind of zero level of consciousness because it confuses the treatment or eradication of stress for the eradication of our humanity itself. Being human means that we are stressed about the need to change things. So being without stress means that we're no longer fully human. We might identify this preconception as the problem of humanity, since it reveals a fundamental concern about the kinds of lives that human beings are supposed to lead and the kind of lives that we are not supposed to lead, that is, lives that are not appropriate to human dignity. Rather than representing an enhancement or a purification of human life, as we saw in the last sessions, the fear here is that mindfulness is a form of humiliation. Now, these kinds of fears about mindfulness have a long pedigree throughout history, as we'll see later in the course. In general, commentators are keen to see them as indications of our fears about ourselves, rather than fears about mindfulness per se. However, something that does emerge very clearly from this nightmarish model of the zombie is the common and pervasive idea that mindfulness is a powerfully transformative practice. Indeed, to some extent, the zombie might be seen as representing the opposite evaluation of some of the same transformations identified in the models of the monk and the ninja, where they were positively evaluated. In any case, our friend the zombie will stick around with us to help us during the rest of this course. But before we wrap up this first module with a summary in the next session, I would also like to introduce our final mindfulness model, the hippie, who emerges as a similar but much less extreme figure to the zombie. One of the fascinating aspects of the hippie as a model is that there is much less consensus about whether he or she is a positive or a negative model in terms of their association with mindfulness. For instance, the hippie is often represented as a countercultural radical embodying political protest against the rampant materialism and ambition of capitalist society through practices of self-transformation. And he or she is represented at the same time as having dropped out of human society by giving up on instrumental reason and conventional conceptions of selfhood. So the hippie is a model of coping with modernity and of failing to cope with it all at once. The hippie is both the dream for some and the nightmare for others. When it comes to mindfulness, then, the model of the hippie expresses all kinds of often conflicting preconceptions about the psychological and social significance of the practices involved. So our friend the hippie will join us throughout the rest of this course to help out as we navigate all of these issues and after she wakes up. So you've made it through to the end of the first module of this course, and I'm wondering how you're doing. To some extent, this module has been atypical, at least insofar as the material in this lesson has focused more than usually on self-reflection for you. Instead of working our way through scientific research on the neurophysiological correlates of mindfulness meditation, which we'll do in the next module, or the conceptual underpinnings of mindfulness in different philosophical traditions, which we will do in module 3, or even the ideological and political significance of mindfulness in contemporary societies, which we'll do in module 4, this module has required you to reflect on your own motivations and preconceptions about mindfulness. In other words, at least in a very particular sense, you have been the subject material for this first module, and I hope you've managed to give yourself some space to inquire into yourself here. It's not always an easy thing to do, and it goes against nearly everything we're usually told at school and in university, where the idea that knowledge might be importantly dependent upon the knower is generally frowned upon. In today's educational environments, in general, we quest relentlessly for a form of objective, instrumental knowledge, on which we have no effect other than simply to bring it into our possession. So it's not always easy or comfortable for us to engage with a more subjective, formative sense of knowledge, which not only relates to us, but also relies upon us. In some ways, though, despite its slightly unusual focus on our own motivations, preconceptions, and reflections, this first module provides a model for the rest of this course. As a field, mindfulness requires us to be open to experiential learning and to take ourselves seriously as our first, best, and most reliable source of such learning. Indeed, this is one of the primary motivations for including in this course the meditation labs, which you're also experiencing for the first time in Lesson 2 of this module. They will appear in Lesson 2 of all the subsequent modules as well. And I'm really interested to know how you get on with the meditation practices in this module, especially in the context of the reflections we've been working on in the rest of the lessons in the module. So I'm looking forward to seeing your posts about all of this. Your insights are not only valuable to you and to me, but also to your colleagues and your friends in this course, so please share them. When it comes to our motivations and preconceptions about mindfulness, the real point of this first module has been to reveal the breadth and richness of the various different understandings of it. It is one of the most immediately troubling things about mindfulness, at least when we first approach it, that there is so much ambiguity, doubt, and uncertainty about what it really means. And there are so many voices and movements in contemporary societies attempting to claim it, or to appropriate it, or control it as a concept, a practice, and a movement. For some of us, this can make approaching this field confusing, and given its apparently transformative nature, it can also make us feel vulnerable in the face of such confusion, as though we're exposing ourselves to something potentially toxic or subversive. However, in this module, we've sought to embrace the diversity of this field as part of its richness and potential. We've explored a number of popular conceptions, preconceptions, and misconceptions about mindfulness today, accepting that they form part of a landscape. By mapping out some of these ideas using some archetypes and models, like our new friends, the scientist, the monk, the ninja, the zombie, and the hippie, we've gained a pretty good sense of how flexible and elastic this thing called mindfulness is today. One of the things that emerges from all this material is the need to be a little sensitive and accommodating the range of claims made in the name of mindfulness today. Rather than taking a hard line from the start and claiming that everyone else is wrong about mindfulness and that only I, or perhaps only you, really know what it is, one of the things we learn from all this is that mindfulness today has developed as a social and cultural construct. It is constantly assembling and reassembling itself in response to social changes and needs, as researchers, practitioners, and businesses discover new possibilities for its development and perhaps also for its monetization. This idea of a flexible, evolving, and always contemporary construct mindfulness will be essential to the work we do in the rest of this course. We've seen that the landscape of construct mindfulness involves, amongst other things, inquiry and insight into Orientalism, secularism, materialism, discipline, magic, selfhood, intuition, rationality, and humanity. It seems to be characterized by an emphasis on self-transformation through practice of various kinds, where such practices focus on the cultivation of a particular form of present-focused awareness and attention, and where the transformation in question might be towards enhanced well-being, diminished suffering, better psychological adaptation to the world, or even simply towards being better in the grandest sense. We also learn from this module that this complicated culture of construct mindfulness today variously relies upon different historical traditions and associations, each of which makes some kind of claim about their legitimate ownership of the concept and practice of mindfulness. That is, we can see the possibility of a politics of knowledge in which individuals and traditions dispute the meaning of real mindfulness or original mindfulness. This idea of traditions of mindfulness will be a strong feature of the work we do in the rest of this course as we explore how different senses of this complicated term interact historically, conceptually, and practically. For instance, in the next module we'll consider how Buddhist mindfulness relates to an instrumentalized, clinical sense of mindfulness. Given that they're clearly not exactly the same things, can we really say that only one of them is really mindfulness? And come to that, why would we want to say such a thing? In general, this course rests upon the belief that unearthing all these different standpoints, perspectives, instruments and practices and traditions is the best and perhaps the only way to clarify what this thing called mindfulness actually is. This is the demystification of mindfulness, if you like. And yet this process makes no claims to even attempting to establish a single exclusive meaning for the term. Rather, we're interested in seeing the landscape of possibilities. And then, really importantly, I hope that you will make some choices for yourself about where, if anywhere, in this landscape you would like to live. As we've seen already, and we'll see over and over again, one of the basic qualities of mindfulness that is retained in nearly every examination of it we might think of it as the ground on which the landscape has been built, is its dependence upon the experiences and intentionality of its practitioners. So what you think and feel and experience while you're investigating mindfulness really matters for you. In some ways, you're forging your own contribution to this landscape as we go along. So if you decide that mindfulness is going to be part of your life, you need to know that your mindfulness is your own, and that you've discovered it in a mindful way that embodies your own integrity. Now this means, amongst other things, that I'm not going to tell you what mindfulness really is. Indeed, it means I can't. Although I am going to do my best to guide you through the relevant material and to help you with some of the formative experiences. I'm also going to explain some things about myself and my own experiences of mindfulness, not because your experiences need to be the same as mine, but simply because it might be helpful for you to know that I'm sharing this adventure with you. So with that, let's bring Lesson 1 to a close. If you want to head over to the meditation lab, we can make a start over there too. And I'd really recommend that you give yourself at least a week to work on the labs. And then in Module 2, we'll make the leap into the psychological and neuroscientific constructions of mindfulness. So hello and welcome to our first meditation lab here in the beautiful Hortus Botanicus Gardens in Leiden. Today's lab is going to be a little different from those that will follow, so we can make sure that the setup is clear for you, and we'll spend a little time talking about what these labs are for, and then some time talking about some common questions people often have at the start of a practical course like this one. Things like, how am I supposed to sit? What happens if I can't do it? Do I really need to sit in a botanical garden in Leiden, or is it okay if I sit on my bed, in the kitchen, on the floor, at work, and so on? And finally, I'm going to introduce you to some of the practices we're going to try in this module, which include the now famous body scan, a simple sitting meditation, and a less formal mindfulness of a routine activity practice. In future modules, we'll also make use of these labs to reflect back on what we might have experienced in the previous modules. I hope that makes some sort of sense. The basic rationale for this setup is that it quite closely mirrors the way in which a standard MBSR, or mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy course, would be structured if you followed one of those. One of the big differences, of course, is that we're not all sitting together in the same room, able to talk about what emerges as it emerges, or able to support each other spontaneously as we go along. During formal programs, this sort of time for discussion and investigation guided by a suitable teacher is often called inquiry, and sometimes it's just as valuable to practitioners as the practices themselves can be. So I'm going to do my best in these little sessions to address some of the most common issues that arise during inquiry. But I'd really encourage all of you to make use of the community building features in this course in order to form some groups, some support groups perhaps, in which you can discuss your experiences and anything else that happens during practice. Alternatively, or even better in addition, you might think about finding other people in your local area who are following this course and try sitting with them on a regular basis. Even though meditation can be rather solitary and self-sufficient, doing it in company can be really supportive and enriching. Perhaps you might convince a friend or a family member to follow this course with you. One of the other really big differences between this MOOC experience and one you might have if you were attending a class in a physical space each week is the simple factor of time. If your MBSR or MBCT classes were scheduled for a couple of hours each week, say, then you would automatically be following the course on an 8-week cycle, spending a week with certain practices, including homework, before moving on to the next. Unsurprisingly, the time frame for these formal courses has been really quite carefully worked out based on experience and evidence. So I would encourage you to spend at least a week on the exercises in each of our meditation labs before moving on to the next. You'll then be doing the equivalent of that 8-week course in about 5 weeks or so. So it's good to remember that the purpose of these labs is to experience practice, or to practice experience, and indeed to participate in practice. So you'll learn most from them if you take the time to participate fully and properly, and you'll learn really little from them if you just listen to the guidance, try it once, and then move on to the next module. Your purpose here is not to zip through to the end in order to say that you've completed the course. Your purpose should be to experience the material and yourself as we work through the different exercises. Take your time, be gentle with yourself, and be patient. So having said all this, what are these labs going to look like? Well, in general, in each module you'll be introduced to at least 2 mindfulness practices, for which you will also be provided with audio guidance. I suggest that you set aside at least an hour of your time to try this material for the first time, and then suggest that you give yourself a week to experiment with it each day, perhaps reserving about 30 minutes, 20 minutes per day for these practices. You might find it helpful to think at the start about how you're going to fit this into your day. When are you going to do the practices and where? You might be someone who likes to wake up early and so you can fit in 20 minutes before breakfast, or you might hate waking up early and so you'd prefer to practice just before bed at night, or both, or neither. The crucial thing here is that there's no objectively right time to practice, there's just the time and place that's best for you. So it might take some time to experiment and to find out when this is. So think about it, talk about it with your friends, and then make a choice. You can and should experiment a little with all these things, but you should make a commitment right now that you're going to find the time to do this. And if you suddenly realize that you don't have the time to do this, perhaps you should think again about whether this is actually the right time for you to try to follow this course. You can always come back another time when you're really able to fit it in. The last thing you want is for your commitment to practice to become itself a source of stress and anxiety for you. So I think that's enough for the preliminaries in these labs. Let's take a little break now and then come back and talk about how we can get started with Module 1's practices. So welcome back to the meditation lab of Module 1. We're going to talk about some common concerns regarding how to sit, how to know when things are going well, and what to do when you get really bored. One question that always comes up right at the start of these courses is about how we're supposed to sit. What is the correct posture, and how do we know when we're doing it right? Part of the motivation for this question is about the kinds of preconceptions that we often have about what it means to engage in meditation practices at all. We imagine, for example, an austere Zen monk sitting perfectly upright with another monk walking around to check on everyone's posture and then hitting them with a stick when they slouch or fall asleep. Well, thankfully, this is not how things need to be for us. Remember, you've decided to follow a mindfulness course not to engage in a process of training to become a Buddhist monk or a yogi or a martial arts master. So for us, the key thing is really just to be comfortable. You're going to be sitting or lying in one position for quite a long time, let's say for now 20 minutes at a time. So you need to be in a position that isn't going to cause you discomfort. Yes, lots of people like to sit on a cushion, on the ground, in one of various meditation postures, but others sit on a chair or lie in a bed or whatever they like. It's not super important, and certainly not at this stage, and we can come back to posture later if it seems important to you. So for now, just know that it can be helpful for your practice to try to capture your sense of intention and motivation in your posture. We often talk about trying to sit in a way that embodies our intentionality. In other words, when you sit down, take a moment to check in with yourself, to see what your posture communicates to you. How does it make you feel about yourself? For many people, sitting with their back straight and self-supported, that is not leaning back against anything, helps them to feel dignified and determined and focused on their practice, as though they're taking it and themselves seriously. And that's a great foundation for practice already. So we can experiment with posture as we go along, but my main point today is simply that you shouldn't be too worried about it. Just sit, and then we'll see whatever happens next. A second concern that we should deal with at the start is about the idea of progress. This tends to emerge in at least 2 ways in most classes. The first takes the form of anxiety that we should get better at the practices as we practice them, indeed that this is the very purpose of practice. Now, there's some truth to this. You will find that the practices get easier and more natural the more you perform them. However, it's really important that you don't fall into the trap of thinking that there's an end point at which you will have mastered mindfulness, and hence that you should be able to graph your progress from mindlessness at one side to mindfulness at the other. This is not only impossible, but it's also counterproductive. So it's good to keep in mind that your practice doesn't have a purpose per se, rather your practice is your purpose. That is, the purpose of our practice is to make sure we sit down and cultivate mindfulness during the practice. There's no need to stress about what happens next, whether you're doing it right or whether you're getting better at it. Just sit. Just practice, and that's it. A second way that the idea of progress can get into our heads is in terms of the structure of mindfulness courses as a whole. We tend to assume, for instance, that the practices we do in week 1 are easier and less important than the practices we'll do in week 5. So we think we can leave early practices behind and forget about them. But before any of you get this idea, I want to say that it's absolutely not true. The exercises we'll do today might turn out to be the most important and powerful practices you ever encounter, or they might mean nothing to you, or their significance for you might change over time. Indeed, that's most likely. So while there is a logic and a rationale to the sequence of MBSR and MBCT courses, it might be most helpful to look at the practices we encounter throughout as a menu or repertoire from which we can always pick something that suits us. You'll encounter a range of different practices, and if you get to the end of the course and find that only one of them, perhaps the body scan from week 1 this week, feels helpful to you, then so be it. Just to be clear, this is not an excuse not to try everything or not to practice everything to see what they're like, but it is a reason not to stress if some things seem more helpful or more supportive to you than others. Perhaps the last thing to mention then, before I let you get on with this module's practices, is this. It's quite likely that you'll find some of these practices really, really boring. And it's true, they really can be terribly dull. Your feeling of boredom is your mind trying to get you to do something else instead. Instead of sitting, watch your breath. Why don't you watch TV, write an email, have a drink, or do just about anything else? Instead of doing this particular practice, why not skip ahead and try one of the more advanced practices later on in case they're more interesting? Don't do it. To some extent, overcoming the sense of boredom is probably going to be one of your biggest challenges, although eventually it might also become one of your closest friends, and you'll recognize him along the way when he comes to visit and welcome him in. Related to boredom is sleepiness, and for some of us this can be lovely. If you fall asleep while you're practicing, that's absolutely fine. Indeed, it might be exactly what you need. However, you should not pretend that sleeping is the same as practicing. If you're asleep, you're not doing the exercise. So if you fall asleep during the body scan today, you should wake up and do the body scan, otherwise you haven't done it. Now, I think that's more than enough. Certainly enough chat for Module 1. So the practices for Meditation Lab 1 are very simple and foundational. You can find the guidance in the resources section of this course. In general, they're focused on identifying our autopilot, that is, our surprisingly resilient ability to live life mindlessly, and on starting to pay more attention on purpose to the sensations we experience in our bodies, making us more mindful about ourselves and our activities. So in this module, the lab includes a mindfulness of a routine activity, it includes the famous body scan, and it includes our very first sitting meditation. Good luck.
So this question of how people come to mindfulness and how they respond to it's a very big question. And I'll maybe start with what I know best, which is how the group of people I work with come to mindfulness. And this is people with recurrent depression. And they come because they're suffering and they're scared and they have a real fear often of becoming depressed again. They're typically people in their 40s and 50s who had depression start in their late teens and early 20s. They've had numerous episodes. They've tried all sorts of things. They've tried lifestyle changes, medication, possibly therapies, and they are looking for something to help them find ways of stepping out of that, what feels like an inevitable downward spiral into yet another episode of depression. So they're coming because they're suffering. And that, of course, is a very good motivation for wanting to do anything, because that suffering is a way of kind of galvanizing motivation and interest. And if I'm honest, that's the way I came to mindfulness as a young man in my early 20s, late teens. I too, was finding my way in the world and had a fair amount of disquiet, despair, if you want to call it that, depression possibly even. And I was traveling for work for the World Health Organization. I was traveling in India and in Thailand, and became very interested in some of the ideas I was finding out about there and some of the kind of contemplative traditions and in Buddhism, and found it very helpful with my own mind and with my own path, if you like. So I think your question's a very big one, and I think in relation to depression and despair, it's coming from a place of suffering. But there are many, many ways in which mindfulness is now being applied. And so I think people are coming to it for very different reasons. And I think each of those groups of people, each of those individuals would have a whole set of different issues that they're bringing when they first encounter mindfulness. For a whole variety of reasons, for the last probably 3, 4 years, the media has reported mindfulness in an incredibly positive way. And in my view, probably in an overly positive way. And friends of mine who work in the media tell me that, that was unprecedented. And because news is news, for something to be covered in the news, it needs to be new. It was no longer a news story. To say that mindfulness is helpful for this or for that or for whatever. My friends in the media told me that it was in a way inevitable that the next news story would be some kind of backlash. I do think that backlash is actually very healthy. One of the things that we do in mindfulness is we sit with our experience and we try to meet our experience, whether it's positive, whether it's negative, whether it's neutral, with the same qualities of attentiveness, of turning towards, of patience, of equanimity, and of kindness. And I think there are some really interesting themes in the backlash that we need as best we can to meet with those qualities. One of them is, has the evidence been overstated? Has the science been overstated? And I think possibly it has been overstated. I think some of the ways in which the media has reported some of the science have perhaps talked of it in terms of a panacea or in terms of it being helpful or better than other things. And I don't think if you read the papers carefully, that's what it shows or what they necessarily show. So in the area that I work in, which is MBCT for recurrent depression, we've done a series of studies over about, over 10 years now, in which we have looked at mindfulness as an alternative to antidepressants. So we did a pilot trial, which we published in 2008. We did a definitive trial, which we published just last year. And just last week, we published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry issue, an IPD meta-analysis of all the trials to date. And it was we're very proud of the paper because we think it's a very robust and I think balanced review of all the trials to date, which I think do very clearly show three things: that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for recurrent depression is better than usual care, what normally happens in a range of different healthcare services in different countries, including the Netherlands and Belgium and North America and the UK. It shows, I think, pretty clearly that it's about as good as other mainstream active treatments, particularly antidepressant medication, which is what most people with recurrent depression get. So we think that's a really significant finding. It provides a treatment choice for all those people who are looking for a different way to stay well in the long term. And the third thing we did in the study, which is about addressing the backlash, is we actually looked at the papers to see whether they reported adverse events, whether people had significant problems during the study. Hospitalizations, suicide attempts, and deaths. And if they were not reported in the papers, we wrote to the principal investigators and asked them for that data. And we report in the paper adverse events in the mindfulness condition and in all the comparison conditions. And we're able to demonstrate that with high quality MBCT offered by well-trained clinicians, there is no evidence that adverse events are more frequent in MBCT than in any of the control conditions. And in no cases could they be attributed to the intervention. And we think that's really important, given some of the questions that have been raised in the backlash. So in a way, just to finish my answer, I think the way the Oxford Mindfulness Centre is very keen to respond to some of these questions is with those qualities that I gave you before, but also with science. That actually, can we unpack the question, devise the very best methods we can think of, do the science, and then report it responsibly.
Well, I got involved in mindfulness through my interest in Buddhism. In the early 1970s, when I was about 19 years old, I went to India. I became a Tibetan Buddhist monk and became deeply involved in the study and practice of Tibetan Buddhism. And during that period, for reasons I'm not entirely clear about even now, the Dalai Lama arranged for a Burmese Indian Vipassana teacher called U Goenka to run a 10-day Vipassana program at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala. And this was for young Tibetan monks and for Western Buddhist students who were in Dharamsala at the time. So I was curious about this other form of Buddhism, about which I really knew nothing, and participated in this retreat. And effectively, the retreat, although it's called Vipassana, is essentially the practice of mindfulness. And it's done in a fairly rigorous setting, in silence, with quite a strict schedule, 3 days just paying attention to the breath, and then the next 7 days scanning the body from head to toe, observing sensations in the body and the feelings associated with them, which I believe is a technique brought into MBSR2, I believe. So the experience was one that gave me a rather profound surprise. Namely, here I was, a Buddhist monk, presumably someone who knows something about meditation, and yet I was being taught a form of practice that I'd never come across with the Tibetans, and one that was remarkably effective on a personal level. In other words, for the first time in my, by then, 3 or 4 years involvement with Buddhism, I experienced a quality of mind, of stillness, of presence, of attention, that was not focused upon a mantra or a mandala or something I had introduced into the meditation, but was simply a very primary sense of my own body, my own feelings, my own thoughts, my own sensations. And this was something that had been refined in this 10-day retreat to a much higher degree of precision and of vividness than I'd ever known before. And through that retreat, I really discovered mindfulness, and it subsequently became and has remained until today the foundation or the ground for everything I do that I call meditation. So that's basically my own story with that. I could go on, but I think that's the basic introduction. Well, I think this is a moving feast. I think people, say 15, 20 years ago, when they hear of if I suspect 15 or 20 years ago, if people were introduced to Buddhist meditation, call it mindfulness, vipassana, or whatever, they would have come preloaded with a lot of probably somewhat fanciful ideas about Oriental exotic religion and all this kind of stuff. The fact that mindfulness has now become so mainstreamed and has become seen as something that you may do to, work with some health issue, or your partner, your friends, or whatever have done a 8-week Vipassana. If your partner or friends or whatever have done a 8-week mindfulness course, you're going to approach it differently to then. And I think there's a much greater level of information available through the media, available through popular books on the subject now. And so I don't think mindfulness necessarily carries the sort of baggage that it used to, which was obviously heavily weighted by Buddhism. So I think it is a difference now. And possibly some people, for religious reasons, might have some objection to its Buddhist sources. I suspect that's quite likely, though I imagine for younger people that's probably less of an issue. And there may be people now who are looking skeptically on mindfulness. They might have read something negative in the press, or claims that its virtues are being overrated or whatever. So they might not even come on with it with those sort of preconceptions about it being Buddhism in disguise or whatever, but rather as, maybe not entirely trustworthy. So it's difficult to say.
Yeah. So I came to meditation because of a boy. There's a boy, a human boy that was really cute. And we had been together at that point for about 2 years, and he had been practicing and had suggested that I practice. And I was doing a lot of theater at the time. And meditation seemed like the antithesis of theater. Like, why would you be in a room full of people that are pretty interesting and not talk to them and close your eyes and be in silence? And it was like, at the time I really identified as an actor. It was like, I'm an actor, so why would I do that? So I wasn't interested in that. And I went away to acting school. And that first year was really hard, really, really tough. And I came back that summer, went home that summer. And my sweetheart was really happy I was home. And then he said, I'm going to go away for a couple of weeks to go staff a family retreat and then staff a teen retreat right after that. And I was pretty upset because I was going to be home for 3 months, and that meant we had 12 weeks together. So, and then we were going to be apart. And I was like, why would you? We have 3 months together. Let's spend our time together. But he was really committed to volunteering for family retreat. And he said, you can come and volunteer. And I thought, okay, I'll go, but I don't really want to. And I'm only doing this to be with you, to be with my sweetheart. So I went and I hated it. I hated the music. I thought it was too saccharine. I hated the teachings. I thought it was too saccharine. Everyone's talking about their feelings. But the retreat was slowly working on me, but I didn't know that's what was happening. And I remember Ajahn Aro, a monastic in the Theravadan or Thai forest tradition. We were outside the dining hall at Spirit Rock, and he asked me, he said, well, what do you think of this retreat? And I was really straight up with him. I was like, feels like it's too saccharine. It feels like a goody camp, and I don't really like it. And he said, yeah, it's like a goodness camp, isn't it? Right? And he took my words, goody goody, and totally changed them, filled them with this different meaning. And I just remember how soft his eyes were, how interested they were. And I remember him at the time at Spirit Rock, there used to be this path that connected the picnic benches up to the patio area right in front of the meditation hall. I remember him walking up that path and he didn't have any shoes on. I just remember thinking, like, he had so little and he seemed really happy, seemed really present. And I'd essentially like insulted his tradition. It's too goody goody, it's too saccharine, I don't want to be here. And yet he was so kind. And you could see it in his eyes, very kind, very open. So that made an impression on me. And then Betsy Rose during the retreat. Now Betsy Rose's role in the retreat? She's like she teaches the Dharma through song and play and helps make the Dharma really tangible for people of all ages. So she sang the song, which I will not sing to you. The words are, how could anyone ever tell you you are anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you are less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. And as we're singing this, so they have this beautiful practice for all of the staff that are volunteering and holding the families and working with the children. So at the end of the day, we all come together as a community just to talk about the day itself and some of the challenges and the wonderful things about just sharing the Dharma with families and children. And we sometimes end the day by singing. So we were singing the song, and I am like biting my lip and my tongue not to cry. But again, the retreat is like working on me in this way. And it was the last day at the retreat. There's this really beautiful practice where they have all the parents and their parents and the children, they come into the hall, and the volunteers make two parallel lines, and they're just bowing in all of the families. There's this one woman. She and her family had flown all the way from Hawaii to be at this retreat. And we come face to face, and she's like just unabashedly weeping, just like tears of gratitude. And my heart could not take it. Like it just, to this day, I don't quite understand what happened. My heart just opened and I started to weep. There's some vulnerability, some like hardness, some hardness in my heart that just started to like melt and soften. I remember my sweetheart at the end of the closing ceremony said, "Do you want to sit a retreat? A young adult retreat is starting the next day. Do you want to sit there?" And I was like crying snot all over my face. I'm like, yes, I'll go. And during that retreat, I don't know if it was Deborah Lynn Chamberlain Taylor or Diana Winston, but they gave a talk on the night of the Buddha's awakening in the 8 worldly winds. And at that point, I felt like every hardship that I was experiencing, especially in my first year of acting school, felt like it was my fault. Felt like if I were smarter or funnier or had this experience or had that experience or had been educated in this way, well, then I would be faring better. And hearing the teaching on the 8 worldly winds was like, so no matter how I show up, like I will still experience loss and gain, joy and sorrow, praise and blame, like approval and disapproval. Like I'll still experience those things even if I show up perfectly. And it was such like a huge weight. Was like it just fell, and there was so much relief and some like sadness too, of like just recognizing how hard I was on myself. And yeah, I was hooked after that. So I'd go back to school and I'd meditate every day up until May. And then May was like a crazy month because we had all these like assignments to turn in, all these acting projects we were part of, and I just couldn't keep up my practice. So May would wrap up, I'd fly back home to California, go to Spirit Rock, and I'd volunteer. And then I'd volunteer at the Monday nights, and then I'd volunteer for family retreat. And then I'd sit the young adult retreat, and then I'd volunteer for the Abai teen retreat. And then I'd go back to school. And then I'd come back to California for the New Year's teen retreat, volunteer for that. And that would give me enough momentum to get through the school year. So graduated, and I had the choice of like, do I go to New York? Do I go to LA? And whole story, but I decided to come back to California, practice. A job opened up at Spirit Rock, started working in the family program, and ran the family program for about 9 years. And no regrets. I'm so happy. It's like a really good choice. Usually some hardship, usually some loss, usually some like really deep sadness. Just people who, it's like all the strategies that they've used to get them through, like aren't helping them to get through. It's almost like their life has become like the difficulty and challenge has, I know this sounds weird, but it's like it's become a koan. And it's like it like puts you back on it like shocks the mind into like a stillness. Like, okay, I can't function in this way anymore. And I get really curious because I just want to we just all want to experience some peace, some love, a sense of wholeness and completeness. And we see that our patterns aren't leading to that. And it's like, there's gotta be another way. There's just gotta be another way. Usually pain. I've met some people who have, especially in the teen program, like there were some young people who came because their parents made them come. And they found a community. They found like, it wasn't so much the practice, but it was the quality of connection and the quality of the connections and the authenticity. Like there were other teens who like dropped their game face and were just straight up being themselves, talking about some of the challenges of being a teen during this time. And then adults who were also had the courage to drop their game face and just be with them in the truth of that. So there were some teens who came because, yeah, my mom told me to come, and I actually really like it. And there are some people who come out of curiosity. I don't find that those people stay. It's mostly, in my experience, mostly people who have experienced some hardship and are looking for another way to actually be in the world, to be in their lives.